There are 4 phases of movement that were used when looking at this video, including the preparatory phase, where the muscles are prepared to generate force and momentum, the movement phase, which is the critical action part of the task involving acceleration and motion, the follow-through phase, which is the deceleration phase or return to prep phase, and then the recovery phase, which is after the follow-through phase, and it's when the body prepares to regain balance and then start another movement. I recorded my roommate Isabel putting one of the dishes away, which is an instrumental activity of daily living that falls under home management. This involved use of the upper extremity and proper contraction of the glenohumeral joint, as well as each of the smaller descending joints in the upper extremity. First, we will see her come into the preparatory phase of this movement on the right side. She starts the movement by flexing her trunk in order to bend over and reach the plate in the dishwasher. As she flexes at the trunk, she simultaneously flexes about 20 degrees at the cervical spine and rotates about 15 degrees. At this point, she is also doing approximately 90 degrees of shoulder flexion at the glenohumeral joint. In this position of the prep phase, she is also abducting her shoulder about 30 degrees away from the midline of her body, but adducts slightly as the elbow flexes to about 75 degrees at the end of the phase. Her forearm supinates to 15 degrees in order to approach the plate properly, as well as her wrist, which extends and then deviates slightly towards her ulna. Her thumb CMC palmarly abducts, the MP flexes to about 40 degrees, and the IP flexes slightly. All the joints in digits 2 through 5 flex and range from about 50 degrees in the MCPs to 15 degrees in the PIPs and DIPs. In the movement phase on her right side, Isabel goes into slight cervical extension with her neck still slightly rotated about 10 to 15 degrees. Her shoulder extends about 15 degrees as it transitions into roughly 100 degrees of flexion as she reaches up towards the cabinet. There is also about 90 degrees of shoulder abduction, but it is not directly in the frontal plane, so it would technically be scaption. Her elbow extends and her forearm is still supinated. She also ulnarly deviates her wrist to about 10 degrees and extends it to 20 when releasing the plate. Her thumbs, CMC, MP, and IPs are in a similar position from the prep phase. They just extended slightly when she released the plate. Digits 2 through 5 were all flexed at the MCPs between 65 and 90 degrees. PIPs were flexed around 90 degrees and the DIPs were flexed between 15 and 65, all depending on the point in the movement. In the follow-through phase, she starts to come back down into cervical flexion at about 20 degrees. Her shoulder comes into slight extension and it also adducts at about negative 10 degrees because it doesn't come directly to her side. Her elbow remains flexed at about 90 degrees as she follows through after the movement. Her proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints also allow her to pronate about 5 degrees in this phase. Her wrist also goes from about 20 degrees of extension to 0 degrees of flexion, putting her wrist at a neutral position. The CMC joint radially adducts, which brings her thumb back down, but the MP slightly flexes and the IP extends to 0. Her index finger MCP is flexed at 75 degrees, PIP is flexed to 85, and the DIP is flexed to 40. The middle finger joints are flexed a little more than that, and the digits 4 and 5 are in the same position during this phase. In the recovery phase, her cervical spine comes back to how it started, which was flexed to about 20 or 25 degrees. It is still slightly rotated as well at about 10 degrees. Her shoulder extends about 10 degrees during this phase, which brings her arm basically back to neutral, which is also the case for adduction, except it is at about negative 5 degrees, so not fully at her side. Her elbow also remains flexed at about 70 degrees at the end of the whole movement. Her forearm is also very slightly supinated at about 5 degrees, with her wrist extended to barely 10 degrees and ulnarly deviated to about 5 degrees. Her thumb CMC adducts back to 0 degrees, and both the MP and IP are flexed to 5. The index finger is flexed at the MCP 75 degrees, PIP 85 degrees, and DIP 40 degrees. Then her middle ring and pinky fingers are all the same. Now on the left side for her preparatory phase, her neck is flexed to about 15 degrees and rotated to about 20. Her trunk is also flexed to bend over to reach the plate. Her glenohumeral joint is abducted about 30 degrees away from the midline, and her elbow is flexed between 5 and 10 degrees. The wrist does not flex or extend, it remains in neutral during this phase. There is slight flexion in the MPs and IPs of her thumb, both are about 5 degrees. The rest of her 4 digits, index to pinky finger, are all estimated to be the same during this phase. The MCPs are all flexed to about 10 to 15 degrees, PIPs are flexed to 60 degrees, and DIPs are flexed to 70 degrees. In this phase on the left side of her body, her neck extends slightly to about 5 degrees as she reaches up to put the plate away. Her neck is also still slightly rotated to about 20 degrees. In this phase, the glenohumeral joint is extending about 15 degrees and abducting about 5 degrees away from her side. Her elbow remains flexed at about 5 or 10 degrees throughout all of the phases, and her wrists remain in neutral throughout the movement phase. Like the preparatory, her thumb, MPs, and IPs were flexed between 5 and 10 degrees, as well as all joints of digits 2 through 5, which were flexed to about 10 or 15 degrees at the MCPs, 60 degrees at the PIPs, and 70 degrees at DIPs. During the follow-through phase, her neck comes back into 20 degrees of flexion and remains rotated about 10 to 15 degrees. Her glenohumeral joint then comes back to the neutral position at 0 degrees after being extended in the previous phase. Her shoulder also adducts and comes back to her side, which is 0 degrees, after being slightly abducted before. The elbow is again flexed between 5 and 10 degrees, and the wrist is neutral. Her thumb is also in the same position. MPs are flexed around 5 or 10 degrees, and the IPs are flexed slightly at 5 degrees. Like the rest of the phases, digits 2 through 5 remain in the same flexed positions. MCPs are at about 10 to 15 degrees, PIPs are around 60, and the DIPs are about 70. In the last phase of the movement on her left side, her neck is still flexed about 20 degrees and rotated about 5 or 10 degrees. After her shoulder comes back to her side in the follow-through phase through adduction, it remains there during the recovery phase. Given that, there are 0 degrees of shoulder flexion and adduction. Even as she approaches and gets back to the resting position, her elbow remains slightly flexed. However, her wrist is still in neutral with 0 degrees of pronation and or supination. Her thumb and digits all remain in a slightly flexed position as well as she approaches the rest position. Her thumb MPs and IPs are flexed to about 5 or 10 degrees, and digits 2 through 5 are flexed at the MCPs about 10 to 15 degrees, 60 degrees at the PIPs, and 70 at the DIPs.